North Korean leader Kim Jong Un projects an image of strength to the world with fearsome military and nuclear warheads. But the country's greatest weakness lies within its own borders. Yes, you heard that right. North Korea's demographic crisis is creating cracks in Kim Jong Un's unshakable image. And this tragic situation is evidenced by a video of Kim Jong Un crying in front of his citizens. So why is North Korea's population shrinking? How might the declining population affect Kim Jong Un? Let's analyse why North Korea's population is declining and the risks this poses as the country moves closer to being wiped off the map. In December 2023, North Korean President Kim Jong Un broke down in tears while discussing his country's declining birth rate. This was the first time Kim publicly acknowledged that North Korea's population decline was a problem, and the numbers paint a chaotic picture. North Korea's total fertility rate is estimated to fall to 1.8 in 2023, below the replacement level fertility of 2.1 children per woman. If the current trend continues, North Korea's working-age population, the number of people between the ages of 15 and 64, could begin to decline by 2030. North Korea's overall population of 26 million could then melt away from 2034 onwards. All these risks are exacerbating Kim Jong's concerns, because if this downward trend in fertility rates continues, it could create a major crisis for the country. A furious Kim has chosen to put the onus on mothers to prevent the birth rate from falling and to raise children. North Korea has promoted a maternal protection policy to encourage more births and reduce the infant mortality rate. However, it remains to be seen how useful this policy will be. But this growing demographic crisis is not just North Korea's problem. Some East Asian countries, such as China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, are also facing similar population problems, albeit for different reasons. China, for example, has experienced 2 consecutive years of population decline in both 2022 and 2023 due to low birth rates, and is currently sitting at 1.7 births per woman. China could therefore lose up to 109 million people by 2050, or its population could shrink by half by 2100. Japan's fertility rate of 1.2 births per woman is the lowest ever recorded and marks the 8th consecutive year of decline. Of course, this is not the only country facing a demographic crisis. North Korea's eternal enemy, South Korea, suffers from the same problem. South Korea's birth rate stands at 0.68, which is quite appalling. South Korea's population of 51 million could be halved by 2100. But unlike Kim Jong Un, the Seoul government is making efforts to combat this situation. Over the last 18 years, South Korea has spent $300 billion on fertility-boosting initiatives. The Seoul government is even creating a new ministry to address these and other key demographic concerns, such as aging, migration, and housing. Additional strategies include matchmaking events with cash rewards for couples who start relationships, and policies aimed at reducing commute times and improving work-life balance. So far, however, these efforts have had limited success. Young South Koreans face significant financial barriers to starting a family, especially in the Seoul metropolitan area, where real estate prices are very high. Changing cultural norms have led many millennials and Gen Zers to prioritize their careers and personal freedoms over traditional family life, resulting in declining marriage and birth rates in the country. So why is the situation in North Korea more dire while East Asian countries are grappling with a similar problem? The answer lies in the economy. South Korea, Japan and China have developed wealthy and stronger economies, but the same cannot be said for North Korea. The country still relies on a labour-based economic model. The North Korean economy relies heavily on people and physical labour rather than technology or automation. This labour-based approach, combined with a lack of technological skills, means that automation cannot replace the working population. North Korea's emphasis on racial purity means that migration is off the agenda. So North Korea stands as a rare case of a poor country experiencing population decline at the same rate as its richer and more modern neighbours. Without technological advances, North Korea cannot offset its shrinking labour force with machines or efficient processes as any developed country with less fuel, machinery, or advanced technology would. Kim needs a rapidly growing population to support his labour-intensive farm and industrial sectors and to fill the ranks of one of the world's most militarised states. Therefore, a declining fertility rate and a shrinking working-age population means fewer people will be available to support the economy. This leads to potential difficulties in sustaining productivity and economic growth. In this context, we see North Korea getting older before it gets richer. The reasons for this go back to the past. Before the Korean peninsula was divided, it was under Japanese rule from 1910 to 1945, and in the 1940s the total population of the peninsula was around 25 million. But after the defeat of the Japanese, and following the Second World War in 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided into two parts. The north was ruled by the Soviet Union, and the United States ruled the south. North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and later China, was a communist state, while South Korea, supported by the United States and other Western allies, was anti-communist and capitalist. So, due to growing tensions between the two groups and North Korean leader Kim Il-sung's desire to unify Korea by force under communist rule, a civil war broke out on the Korean peninsula in June 1950. The war lasted for 3 brutal years and resulted in a significant loss of life, with millions of casualties, and resulted in changing demographics on both sides. At the time of the partition in 1945, the population of North Korea was estimated at 9.3 million. From 1945 to 1949, the country saw almost no population growth through cross-border migration. But then, it lost more than 1 million people due to heavy casualties during the Civil War of the 1950s and a massive refugee exodus to South Korea. After the Korean War, the country saw a huge increase in population due to peace and the Great Post-War Rehabilitation period. The population increased exponentially from 8.4 million in 1953 to 15 million in the 1970s, growing at about 3% per year. There was also an important factor that contributed greatly to this growth, and that was the revival of the country's economy. With the country in rubble after 3 years of a terrible war, something had to be done to revive the collapsing economy. Influenced by the Soviet Union and China, North Korea's key allies at the time, Kim Il-sung adopted a similar command or centrally planned economy to ensure rapid economic recovery and development. Under the command economy, which still exists in North Korea to this day, the state controls all means of production, and the government sets priorities and emphasizes economic development. That is, the government decides which goods and services to produce, how much to produce, and how to distribute them, thus giving them full control of the mobilization of resources. Under this policy, they began to implement a series of economic plans to rebuild the country's economy, infrastructure, and industrial capacity, which had been severely damaged during the war. These plans were modelled after Soviet-style economic strategies that focused mainly on heavy industry, agriculture, and energy production. To carry them out successfully, the Soviets provided North Korea with substantial financial aid, technological assistance, and experts. China, on the other hand, saw the country as a crucial buffer zone to separate China from South Korea and Japan, which were part of the American sphere of influence. But beyond these reasons, there is a more important factor. Both the Soviets and the Chinese wanted to prevent the further spread of capitalism to the Far East at all costs. To this end, China provided the necessary funds and political support. So, with considerable help from both allies, the government made an ambitious effort, launching its first 3-year plan in 1954. The plan prioritized the reconstruction and expansion of heavy industries such as steel, machinery, mining, and chemicals. A significant portion of resources was allocated to build new industrial facilities and restore damaged factories, as well as other infrastructure, including railways, roads, bridges, and communication systems to restore basic economic functions. Other key areas, such as agriculture and energy, were also targeted to achieve food self-sufficiency and support industrial growth. By the end of 1956, these efforts had borne fruit, and the first 3-year plan was widely considered a success in North Korea, as it led to a partial recovery of the country's industrial and agricultural sectors. The North Korean government claimed to have not only met but also exceeded many of its goals, laying the groundwork for subsequent economic plans that further expanded industrial and agricultural production, such as the 5-year plan in 1957 and the 7-year plan in 1961. The country's rising prosperity had a profound impact on its population. The fertility rate reached an all-time high of almost 4 births per woman in 1970, the highest rate ever recorded in North Korean history. But things did not always stay that way. By the late 1970s, the North Korean economy was unable to repay foreign loans from the West and Japan. The deteriorating economy and shrinking wallets had a direct impact on the population. The government began to encourage only 1 or 2 children per couple. To reinforce this policy, birth control and abortion were made widely available to its citizens. But North Korea's inability to maintain a public distribution system for food following the collapse of the Soviet bloc and aid cuts from China in the 1990s led to a massive famine in which an estimated 2.5 to 3.5 million people died out of a population of about 20 million. The fertility rate fell below 2. The state cut population control policies to encourage births in the 1990s. Only the famine forced more women to work on the black market. Poor health infrastructure, with a high infant mortality rate in the 1990s, reinforced the trend of declining birth rates. In the 2010s, North Korea's fertility rate was estimated at 1.38. In 2015, the government banned abortion and birth control procedures. Yet, North Korea's food shortages in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic were hardly conducive to raising families, and this likely prompted Kim to speak publicly about the falling birth rate as a challenge to the country. This looming demographic crisis does not attract much attention compared to North Korea's nuclear or missile programs. However, the falling birth rate will have major implications for the kind policies the North Korean government might adopt. So far, the government has tackled the falling birth rate by appealing to the ideological mandate of women as childbearing heroes. The country has implemented a pro-natalist policy to encourage higher birth rates among its citizens, and state media often emphasizes the benefits of having more than one child and portrays it as a way to strengthen the country. The government promotes large families as a patriotic duty and tries to provide various incentives and other benefits to families with many children. Such benefits include supplementary rations, childcare services, or other state-sponsored assistance. But the effectiveness of these incentives is limited by economic hardship and food shortages. Families with multiple children are also provided with school supplies on major anniversaries, while parents of triplets and quadruplets receive food and medicine free of charge and are preferentially allocated houses. Since 2007, mothers giving birth to a second child are also reportedly provided with additional food for 6 months. Under fertility promotion policies, pregnant women also receive extra benefits. To encourage childbirth, the country has extended maternity leave to 240 days, 60 days before and 180 days after childbirth. The government requires pregnant women to have free medical checkups once a month and once a week as they approach delivery. During this time, mothers receive prenatal and postnatal subsidies equivalent to 3,000 North Korean won. So far, however, such incentives have not yielded positive results. In fact, one of the most important reasons for this is that motherhood is no longer seen as the only qualification of women. Hyunin Ai, a 2004 defector from North Korea and a non-resident research fellow at the Institute of Unification Studies at Ilha Women's University in Seoul, says that women have begun to engage in informal economic activities to support their families in an environment of increasing marketization, rather than men who are forced by the government to work for free. Despite the North Korean government's claim of gender equality, traditional gender roles and a hierarchical division of labour based on gender persist. This has allowed women to be relatively free to leave government-assigned workplaces. As women adapted to the double burden of traditional roles and new livelihood work, social norms about marriage and family also adapted, and the changes continued even as the country partially recovered from the crisis. According to defectors and reports from inside North Korea, young people now postpone marriage when looking for a partner and prioritize wealth over power. In a 2014 survey of 54 North Korean defectors born between 1989 and 1994 conducted by the Institute for Far Eastern Studies in Seoul, more than one-third of respondents said that they felt that economic conditions for marriage would have to be met during their time in North Korea, or that they had no plans to marry at all. In the same survey, women began to have a stronger voice in the household, while men's power declined. Changes in perceptions within individual households reflected the unraveling of North Korea's concept of the big socialist family, in which the entire nation was seen as one family, the leader as the grandfather, the ruling Workers' Party of Korea as the mother, and the people as the children. But North Korea is unlikely to adopt measures such as cutting inefficient and low-paid state jobs or expanding the private sector, and instead is increasingly cracking down on the black market and tightening state control to root out anti-socialist behaviour. Let us now examine what this demographic crisis could lead to. A shrinking population could also limit North Korea's foreign policy. North Korea is currently compensating for the lack of quality in its military power compared to South Korea by relying on quantity. Currently, the North Korean army has 1.3 million active soldiers in its ranks, or 5% of the population, while South Korea has 500,000 active soldiers out of a population of 51 million. North Korea recruits women into the armed forces to serve for up to 5 years. This can delay births. Just one war would be catastrophic for the population. The biggest threat in Kim Jong Un's eyes is undoubtedly the fear of losing the stability of his family's regime. As history has shown, a population collapse could undermine his government's ability to maintain social control. We all know how the state relies heavily on propaganda and military power. But with a declining and increasingly impoverished population, its grip on power could weaken. Popular discontent could rise to unprecedented levels, and the Kim family could face difficulties in maintaining its loyalty base, especially within the military, which is vital to the stability of the regime. This could create a power vacuum in North Korea, leading to internal conflict and military intervention, or perhaps to the country being laundered by South Korea under complex and potentially hostile circumstances. All this is nothing short of a nightmare for Kim Jong Un. That is why the leader of one of the most repressive regimes in the world is crying and begging for a massive demographic change in front of his citizens. But North Korea may be one of the most repressive regimes in the world, but it cannot force people to give birth when they don't want to, whether the regime wants to or not. Demography, as the saying goes, is destiny. Population is and will remain the foundation of a state's economic and military power. Unless the right measures are taken to reverse the declining birth rate, a new era of North Korea's demographic peace may have just begun. But what could happen if the demographic crisis leads to the country's collapse? In the event of collapse, there are several issues to consider, and none of them are simple. First and foremost is the Chinese reaction. In any scenario where the North Korean regime falls, many of its former subjects will move across the Yalu River. Beijing is already uneasy about its relationship with Western minorities. Several million ethnic Koreans already live in China, and Beijing fears another problem in its border regions, this time in the northeast. This potentially troubled region is too close to the growing middle class in Beijing, and reports of repression will be much harder to contain. Chinese Koreans will also have a strong voice in the new, larger Korea across the Yellow Sea. In a gamble aimed at maintaining the status quo, China supported peace talks between the US and North Korea, an important step towards normalization. The North rejected the deal because the US insisted on addressing denuclearization at the same time, an important goal if South Korea were to join. Any normalization of the relationship between North Korea and its allies could have long-term consequences for Beijing. Economic liberalization would certainly allow many more goods purchased in China to enter North Korea, But increased consumer lifestyles also bring with them aspirations for political freedom that would shake the North Korean regime, and thus Beijing itself. On the other hand, lasting peace on the peninsula would certainly lead to a change in the military alliance between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. The South Korean and Japanese militaries are the 11th and 7th most powerful in the world and are backed by state-of-the-art anti-missile air and logistics capabilities from the United States. The recent announcement that the US will deploy THAAD in South Korea is seen as a threat to China. Since the South Koreans oppose the deployment, it will be difficult for Seoul to sell the system after peace, and certainly Washington will seek a peace dividend by significantly reducing its own forces on the peninsula and in Japan. In geopolitical terms, peace on the peninsula is a gain worth the long-term problems of a liberated North. The next issue is peace between a unified Korea and China, with more than the possibility of tensions moving north along the 38th parallel towards the new international border. China must be convinced that Korea poses no threat and that the withdrawal of US troops could be the price Beijing pays for accepting a unified Korea. Any aggression by Seoul during an imminent collapse of Pyongyang could be interpreted by China as a need to cross the Yalu River, where Beijing already claims the inter-river islands. There is the possibility of a new partition with China occupying the northern half of North Korea up to Pyongyang, saving the elites occupying Pyongyang. In the case of a very fraternal occupation, the prospective Chinese zone would fulfill two objectives for China at the same time. It would no longer threaten the South or Japan, and it would be able to establish a flexible regime that would drive a wedge into the 70-year-old alliance between Beijing and Pyongyang. Setting China's international border with Korea about 100 miles south of the Yalu River would create a buffer zone between China and a powerful Western rival. The final issue, and in many ways the most pressing, is the issue of the North's weapons of mass destruction. Conservatives could be incentivized to use them to fulfill the regime's survival objective, or generals with a warlord mentality could use them to establish their own quasi-kingdom. Should Western intelligence be able to predict a collapse, military forces in the South would be on high alert, and any provocation could trigger an artillery duel that quickly escalates into an airstrike. In the ensuing chaos, South Korean and American forces would likely quickly try to seize WMD facilities. If the Chinese are coming south, this creates a dangerous situation in which Allied forces could bomb Chinese forces and turn a clean-up operation into a superpower conflict. In some cases, South Korean or US ground forces in the northernmost regions could be captured by Chinese forces, creating a very open bargaining chip for Chinese objectives. The collapse scenario is getting closer to reality. The continued erratic behavior of a spoiled despot will continue to push North Korean elites to consider better alternatives. As Kim Jong Un becomes increasingly isolated, he will undoubtedly double down on his bizarre style of governance and further alienate his domestic audience. The United States will need to start thinking seriously about what a unified Korea and China, not just South Korea, would do. Thank you for tuning in.